There we go. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this free 4-hour workshop on API testing in Python. My name is Bas Dijkstra. I am the director of Academy at Inspire Testing, which means I am responsible for creating and delivering training opportunities for Inspire testing staff, but also to our increasingly global customer base. Before I joined Inspire Testing, I've been in software testing and automation for about 15 years as an engineer, as a consultant, and for the last couple of years, mostly as a trainer. I do a bit of blogging, a bit of public speaking. So a nice mix of a lot of different kinds of activities, really. As part of my, this is a new initiative from the Inspired Academy, where we thought it would be good to, and next to all the courses that we offer, all the commercial courses that we offer through the Inspired Academy, we thought it would be a great idea to invest in the community, give back to the community, because if there's anything I've learned in the last 15, 16 years, it's that you can't do without community, really. So yeah, consider this as Inspired Testing and as the Inspired Academy giving back to the software testing and software development community. What we are going to talk about today is, as you probably would have expected, API testing in Python using requests and PyTest. I'll tell you all about requests and PyTest in a moment. But first, quickly, why API testing? Because I think it's an important skill. It's an increasingly important skill. Software systems these days are becoming ever more distributed. Where back in the days you had monoliths with a graphical user interface and some kind of business logic and a database, and that was all really tightly coupled and interwoven. Modern software systems are much more highly distributed, which means they are constructed out of loosely coupled components that communicate with one another, often through APIs. And all of these components can be developed in different teams, different departments, maybe even different companies on different continents sometimes, which means that there's an increasingly big the role of APIs in these systems, because APIs are the glue that connects all of these components. Which means that APIs and knowing how to work with APIs and how to test them and how to write tests for them is an increasingly important skill for any modern software tester. So that's one of the reasons why we thought it would be good to talk to you a little bit about API testing. And because there's no better way to learn something than by actually doing it, we thought it would be great to offer this to you in the form of a workshop instead of, well, just a talk or a live demo or anything. That's why today's session will be a 4-hour session. So it's a proper workshop with exercises, time to do the exercises, time to review exercises. So your participation is highly valued here. So it's definitely not just going to be me talking for 4 hours straight. There's plenty of time. So I've prepared 6 rounds of exercises in total. Each of those rounds of exercises will be introduced by me telling you a little bit about APIs, about testing APIs. About how to do that in Python, how to do that using the requests library, how to do that using PyTest, those kinds of things. There's always more than one, so there's no, for all of the exercises, there are probably multiple ways to solve it, so I'm always interested to see how other people approached and solved an exercise. So there will be room for that as well. So yeah, that's going to be the general structure of this session. We will schedule a couple of breaks in between for you to stock up on coffee or tea or soft drinks, or go for a bathroom break or whatever. I'll probably schedule 2 of them of about 10 minutes in length. And next to that, because we have a room and time for you to work on exercises, and when the time has come to work on this exercise, and I'll introduce them to you one by one, of course. That's probably also a good moment to have a quick break. If you need to drop off at any moment, that's fine too. We appreciate you being here, but we're not holding you hostage in this session. So if you need to drop off because of, I don't know, other work commitments, family duties, meetings, who knows what else, that's fine. This meeting is recorded. We'll publish the recording soon after this session. It will probably take us a couple of days to process it and to make it available for everybody, but the meeting, this session, is going to be recorded, so you can always have another look at some other point in time. All right, I see we've got 87 participants, 88 now, minus a couple of people from Inspired Testing, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. So first, thank you, Karin, for setting this up. Thank you, Candice, for taking care of a lot of the logistics. But that means that we've got quite a few people in this. In all honesty, I don't think I've ever run a workshop for an audience of this size. So that's going to be a first for me as well. But I'm really looking forward to it. So without further ado, let's get started. Let me start by sharing my screen here. And the first thing that I want to tell you a little bit about is API testing, and more specifically, the requests library. So first of all, why Python? Because I think Python has a little bit of a lower barrier of entry compared to languages like Java or C#. For those of you who are not very familiar with writing code, that's all fine. You'll be doing a lot of coding today in this session. But what I like about Python is that the code that you will write is relatively concise. So it's short, it's not a lot of code, and it's highly readable. What I like about the requests library is that it makes working with APIs almost a breeze. So the request library helps you write tests for APIs in an easy manner without having to deal with writing lots of code. So let's get started. So the way I'll approach this is I'll do some live coding for you. I don't have any slides. So I'll do everything based on live coding because I think that's much more lively and interactive way of doing things. It also allows you to see that I don't know everything as well, so I might even have to look something up or Google something if I don't exactly know how to do something. But I think at least you can see how things work, and you can see that things really work, which is much harder to do with slides. Feel free that as I type and as I show you something to type along. And as soon as we get to the exercises, I'll give you a link to the document with the exercises. I'll keep sharing the code that I wrote on the screen. So you have the exercises on screen in a link. It's a PDF that I put online. You've got the code, so you've got everything you need to work on the exercises. So the first thing we need to, so I asked everybody in preparation for this session to set up Python on their system. So let's quickly confirm on my system that Python is working. You've probably downloaded an installer for your operating system and then run that installer. Installing Python is a really straightforward process. And just confirm that Python installed here. I run python -- version, and it tells me that my active version of Python is Python 3.10. Awesome. So that's the first prerequisite. I can't write and run Python code if I don't have a Python development environment installed on my computer. But we're good to go. The only other prerequisite, the only other requirement that was in the invitation was an IDE, an integrated development environment. I'm not going to go into a war on what's the best IDE. You could even do this in Notepad++ or just regular Notepad if you wanted to. I like working with an IDE because that helps me write and run code a lot more efficiently. And I'm a big fan of the JetBrains group of products, which means that for writing and running Python code, I will use PyCharm. But there are lots of other good IDEs. If you use Visual Studio Code for Python, that's fine. There's probably other Python editors that if you use VI, if you're really old school, that's fine with me as well. Again, I'm not going to go into a war on what's the best IDE. I just prefer IntelliJ. Since we'll be doing a lot of running of the tests and inspecting of the results through the command line, it doesn't really matter all too much anyway which IDE you use. But the first thing we typically need to do when we get started is creating a new project, creating a new code project. And the typical way to do that, at least in IntelliJ, if you have another IDE, I am going to assume that you know how to do that yourself. If you'd ask me how to do that in Visual Studio Code, for example, I would have no idea because I've never really used it. I know it's what all the cool kids use, but that's probably why I'll stick to PyCharm. So I'm going to start a new project. That's going to be just a pure Python project. And I'll put that in, oh no, not React Native, a pure Python project. And let's call that Python API testing workshop, for example. Let's work workshop. All of the other settings are fine. So all I need to do is click create. It creates a virtual environment, which is basically a gated, an isolated environment, which allows me to install packages without it influencing the rest of my system. And the first thing I need to do here is to activate that environment. If you are okay with installing packages globally on your system, you don't need to do this. But if you want to use the virtual environment, you need to activate it, which you do typically by running the activate script in the script subdirectory of your virtual environment, and you'll see that your virtual environment is active because it's listed in brackets here. But if you don't use it, that's fine. 2, Let me quickly close some other applications because it seems like they are negatively influencing the performance of my system, or at least that's what Zoom tells me. So this is the first thing that and the first thing we then need to do is install the requests library. So, and you've probably not done that yet because it wasn't in the instructions, because I wanted to make that part of the workshop. But the first thing we need to do is preparing our development environment. If you've installed Python before, you'll also have access to pip, which is the Python package manager, which means that you can simply say pip install requests, and that will install the request library. And depending on whether or not you're working in a virtual environment, it's within the scope of your virtual environment, or globally if you're not working with a virtual environment. So this is my new empty project with a virtual environment and requests now installed. The second thing we need is an API to test. So in the exercises, let me see if I can quickly hide this, hide floating meeting. Oh, there we go. The API you'll use in the exercises is the JSON placeholder type. So that's an API with some dummy test data with enough different, and we'll also see a couple of other APIs, but you'll see that one in the first couple of series of exercises. But for now, let's for the examples, for the explanation, I'm going to use a different API because I'm going to use the same API. I'll give everything away, and it's a workshop, so you need to learn by yourself. So you need at least to figure some stuff out by yourself. The API that I am going to use is the Zippopotamus API, which is an API that returns location data based on zip codes. So I can pass it a country code and a zip code, and it's going to look up that country code and the zip code in a database, and if there's data associated with that country code and zip code, it's going to return the location data. So for example, if I pass in, and that takes two path parameters. The first one is the country code, and the second one is the zip code. So if I request data for the US zip code 90210, it's going to tell me that there's the postcode 90210, the country is the United States, country abbreviation is US, and it will give me a list of places that are associated with that zip code. Now, in the US, that's always, the way the US zip code system works, it's always just one place. And in this case, that's Beverly Hills. And those of you who grew up in the 90s, well, they knew, they probably knew way before I submitted that request that it was linked to Beverly Hills. But for example, if I look up a German zip code in Germany, it returns a list of places because the German zip code system allows for more than one place to be associated with any given zip code. So this will return some. There we are. No, not going to collaborate. There we go. The network tab just requested again. And this will, of course, this API response will also have an HTTP status code, in this case 200, and a number of response headers. And of course, also the response data. And so this is how to do it in a browser. That's not very useful if we want to do automation. So let's see how we can make that same API call and inspect some of the responses in Python code instead. To do that, I'm going to create a new module, a new Python file. So Python files are typically known as modules. And I'm going to call it Exploring an API, because that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to write any automated tests yet. We'll get to that in the second series of exercises, but I'm first going to try to just use requests, do some exploring of an API, some exploratory testing maybe, because you can do exploratory testing using code as well. You need, if you want to do exploratory testing on an API, you'll need a tool anyway. And that could be a tool like Postman or SoapUI. But it can definitely be done in code as well. So let's start with exploring an API. Remember a couple of minutes ago, I added requests as a library to my project. So the first thing I need to do is to import it into my module to make it available. If I want to retrieve the data here, let me quickly copy that endpoint now that I'm at it. What I can do is, from the request library, I can call any of the methods that are associated with the different HTTP verbs. So we've got delete, get, fetch, post, put, you name it. In this case, it's a get because I'm retrieving data. And the only argument I'm specifying, the only argument I need to specify to this method is the endpoint. And this get method, as you can see, it returns an object of type response, which I'm going to store in a variable. And that response object contains the entire response really. So it contains the status code, it contains the response headers, it contains the response body. So let's see if we can print some of that info to the screen. Just to that allows us to do some human visual inspection of whether or not the API reacts as we expected it to. So, for example, let's see if we can print the response status code, which is the status code property is stored in the status code property of this response object. I like string interpolation in Python. So this f string is a string where you can just insert Python code that can be just variables or even statements in Python. Another way to do the same would be to do something like this. And this would result in, but then I need to cast it to a string, which is a little inconvenient. So let me do that the proper way instead. So if I now run this code using Python and then the name of my module, it will perform the API call. Requests will perform the HTTP GET to this endpoint, store the entire response in the response object, and then hopefully print the response status code to the console. And it does. There you go. And so this is one way to inspect our properties of our response. Let's see if we can maybe also print the headers. And we can. Those are stored in the headers property. And that headers property is simply a Python dictionary, or to put it in other words, a collection of key value pairs that contain all of the headers associated with the response. There you go. Now it then not only printed the response status code, but also the response headers. So there's a date. A very an important one is the content type, which is an indication sent by the API server, the provider, on the data type of the response body, of the response payload. And so this tells me, this tells the recipient of the response to interpret the response body as JSON. So let's see if we can also print that response body. And I can tell body that is in the content property. Why it's not called body? Please don't ask me, but it isn't. There you go. So I've got the status code again, the headers, and also the body. There's a, so this is quite raw. And just to show a little trick, if you want to pretty print the JSON response body, there's a neat trick to do that in Python. I need the JSON library as well, which I don't need to install because it's a library that's available in Python by default. But I can then say JSON.dumps response.content, and I can even say, well, I use 4 spaces for indentation. And if I run this code again, it's going to complain because object of type bytes is not JSON serializable. Because I need to, there we go. I need to extract the JSON first. Much better. There you go. As if not everything works right the first way in my system as well. And so this tells me from the response object, extract the JSON response body, and this dumps method then pretty prints it using 4 spaces of indentation to the console, which is arguably much easier on the eyes compared to everything being in a single line. And so this shows me the exact same data as we saw on our screen here. But now we have a way to interact with it programmatically using Python and requests. And I can use this to maybe say, well, what if instead of this, I specify some other country code, zip code. And that gives me so status code of 200, very similar headers, but obviously different data, which I can then inspect as a human being to see, well, is this what I expected, or are there any problems here? I could maybe say, well, what if I specify something that's not a valid zip code? And that results in a status code of 404, response headers, and an empty response body, which is not exactly what I expected, in all honesty. This tells me that this API doesn't really do input validation, or it doesn't really do input validation in the way I expected it to do. Because of 404 tells me that 404 is the equivalent not found, which means, well, this is the API telling me I couldn't find any data for this zip code. Well, I would expect, because this is not a valid zip code, it's a banana, It's not a zip code. This tells, I would have expected the API to return a response with a status code that tells me, well, this is not a valid input. Or rather, I would expect an HTTP status code equal to 400 bad request. Now, I know the reason, or I think I know the reason why this API doesn't do this, because it accepts data for a lot of different countries. And there are countries such as the UK and Canada, for example, that have zip codes with which can be alphanumeric. And so they contain letters as well as digits. And so that's probably why it accepts alphanumeric characters as part of the zip code, and it doesn't say, well, this is not a valid. So it doesn't do that on a per country basis. If I would do something like this with special characters, it still doesn't do proper input validation. So it still gives me a 404. But this is also things that I can discover while exploring my API. So this API doesn't support it, but the API that I'm going to ask you to explore in the first exercises, the first series or the first round of exercises does support sending data to it. Because we've only retrieved data using an HTTP GET. But there are plenty of APIs, and if you write tests for APIs, you typically also want to send data to it. So let's create a data object. And in case your API accepts JSON data, which is all that we are going to look at for now. We'll talk about XML later today, but for now and let's focus on JSON. And JSON in Python is creating JSON in Python using a request JSON payload is really straightforward, because all you need to do is create a dictionary and tell requests to convert that into a JSON payload. So for example, let's say, well, our JSON payload has a place name called, I don't know, Amsterdam, and a country called Netherlands. For example, just an example. This API doesn't really accept data, but let's say, well, this is the payload that I want to send to it. Say I want to post this to a different object. Let's say my API would accept this and post this to this endpoint. With requests, that's really straightforward. So if I have a Python dictionary, so again, a list or a collection of keys and associated values, a list of key value pairs, which is what a Python dictionary is. I can transform that into JSON and ask requests to submit that as the request payload quite easily by saying, well, I'm passing that as JSON, as an additional JSON, an additional parameter called JSON to the post or the put or the fetch or whatever operation it is that accepts the data. And in this case, I have no idea what response status code to expect. Status code instead. Let's quickly comment this out for clarity. There we go. Much better. the response status code 405, which is equal to, let's see, list of cats, method not allowed. Which is the AS API speak for this endpoint does not support HTTP posts. And so it doesn't take any data, it only, and so the only method that's allowed is an HTTP GET. But if I would say, well, I want to know what I've sent anyway, send. And so if I want to ensure that this actually send the data that I expected it to send, I can is the response object has an associated as a property that contains everything about the request that was sent. So requests is nice enough to also store the request. Body and print that, and you'll see that, well, this is the payload as a byte stream. That's what this B indicates that was sent. So you see that this object was properly transformed from Python dictionary into JSON, and subsequently that was sent as the request body. And then the API responded with an HTTP status code 405. So these are just some ways to interact with APIs in Python using the requests. Which leads me to your first exercise. I've gathered all the exercises, descriptions of the exercises in a PDF document. I've just pasted the link to that in the chat. On that question, Amit Kulkarni, can you please let us know which Python version to download? A recent one. So I would recommend anything from 3.8 and up. So the current version is 3.10, I think, 3.10 something. But it will work with any reason. So 3.7, 8, 9, or 10 should all be fine. This link, this document contains all the exercises. Again, I've got 6 pages, 6 series of exercises. What I want you to do right now, and I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to do that, is to basically do what I just shown you, but for a different API. So first create a new project and install requests, and then create a new Python module in your project. So just a new Python file, and then use Python and request to explore some of the different endpoints available at this API. And that API is this one, jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. It comes with a so you can retrieve data of posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. So it's an API that contains a lot of fake dummy test data, which is perfect for this purpose. All HTTP methods are supported, which means you cannot just retrieve data, but you can also post data to it, put data, even try to delete data. It will not actually delete the data, but the API acts as if you have deleted the data. I've given a couple of examples in the exercises of calls and HTTP gets, and a post with a certain payload. And my question to you, my task for you, is to do some exploring on, just like I explored the zip code API, I want you to ask you to explore this type code API. And a couple of questions that you could maybe try and answer is how do these endpoints respond when you send the valid path parameter values? If you send path parameter values that don't make sense. Are the HTTP response status codes that the API returns logical? So because we are exploring the API here, I'm typically not willing to say, well, I'm expecting this. It's more or less before. Let's see how the API responds given a certain input or given a certain request. So this is more about let's see if we can find some interesting problems. In the next exercise, we are going to start writing tests, automation for APIs. And then we are going to compare the actual outcome with some predefined expected values. But with exploratory testing, that's typically more about, literally it's in the name, exploring the API, saying, well, what happens if I do this? Or I wonder how the API behaves if I do that. What I want to show you with this demo and this exercise is that you can do that perfectly in code as well. So using these libraries and writing code is not just for writing automation. It can also help you do exploratory testing, and especially in Python with requests, that doesn't take a whole lot of code. No, you're not supposed to finish exercise 1 to 6 right now, Mani. Thank you for asking. It's really only the exercise 1. So each exercise has a different page. And we'll cover the other exercises, or as many as the time allows, throughout this workshop. But for now, you can focus on the exercise on the first page. So really only exercise 1. We'll get to the other exercises later on in this session. And for you, Amit, for Python starters, how should we go ahead with the exercise? Well, literally, just do what I did. And I'm going to ask some of you, and maybe 1 or 2 of you, to share their screen after after say 10 minutes. We'll get to that. Pratibha, can you send this PDF? I'm not going to. I sent you the link to it. That's in the chat. So you can just click the link in the chat. That's why I published it online, so everybody can view it on their own screen. I want to give you somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes to do this. And if you found some interesting things, or you maybe have some questions on why does this API do what I expect it to do, or why does this API behave in the way it behaves, post it in the chat so we can all read along and see what you found. I'll keep sharing this code with you, so you have an example of how to do it, how to interact with the code on your screen for inspiration. And if you have any questions or anything's unclear, please just post it in the chat, and I'm more than happy to try and help you out as best as I can. And again, everybody, if you see something interesting or a result that you think is worthy of sharing, feel free to share it in the chat. I'd love to see what you come up with. All right, I would love to see, is there anybody who wants to share with the rest of the group, quickly share their screen and tell us what they've seen and tell us what they found, tell us what they did. Please just quickly say yes or I want to in the chat and I'll unmute you. Let's see if there are any volunteers. Is there anybody who found something interesting that they want to share with the rest of the group? Nobody? That's fine too. I hope you got the opportunity to work and to run some tests for and to interact with some APIs and see some output anyway. Rajat, anything you want to share with us? You tried for 2 endpoints.
Yeah, hi Buzz.
Hello.
Hi. Actually, from the exercises, I tried for 2 endpoints. The first one worked, but the post one is giving me an error. So can I share and show?
Yes, I have. Let me see. You should be able to share your screen. Can you try?
Yeah, give me a moment. Yes, can you see?
It takes a while to load, but I can see that that you're attempting to share your screen. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah. So this one worked. The one which you gave in the exercise document. It returned me proper status.
You want to? Do you want to print the response payload? Or
Yes.
as you saw, line 23. So request body is not the property of the response property. So if you want to just print that raw, you could, instead of request body, put content in there.
Okay. Okay, my system. Okay. Content.
There you go. And you can see that that's a property of that nice green brown background color for the request body property. That's an indication given by PyCharm that, well, I don't really recognize this property.
Okay.
Is it still loading or?
Yes. Yeah. Just started. I'm not sure why it is this slow. Okay.
neither am I, but there you go. So
Yeah.
that's a raw response. But
Yes.
there you go. And you see that, well, it returns response status code 201, which is a very typical response status code for a successful post.
Yes.
And it returns the user ID, the title, and the body that you specified, as well as a uniquely generated ID as the last element, which is the new ID for the post. And if you now try to retrieve the post with ID 101, you wouldn't find it because it doesn't actually store the post, but it just acts as if. So it's not actually, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but your new post is not actually stored somewhere. It just pretends it is.
Okay.
But well done.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how it's done. Let's move on to, so this is great for exploring and for just seeing how an API behaves. If you say, well, let's find out if we if there are any troubles or if there's anything we that requires further investigation. But let's now continue by writing some actual tests. And to do that, we cannot rely on requests alone. We also need a testing framework. So, and for those of you who are familiar with Java, that would be either JUnit or TestNG. For those of you working in C#, that would be MSTest or MUnit or XUnit. Python has a huge amount of unit testing frameworks available, but there are two that are really popular, or maybe three. The first one is unit test. It's that the unit testing framework that's literally called unit test. The nice thing about that is that unit test is available in Python so it's not a third-party library. It's available in Python by default. The not so nice thing, well, that's my opinion about unit tests is that you need to write classes for all of your tests. So your tests need to be part of a class. There's also Nose, which is much lesser known unit testing framework. But another very popular unit testing framework in Python, or testing framework, is PyTest. So let's install that one. And if I do that again using pip install PyTest, which installs the latest version of the PyTest unit testing framework in my project. There we go. Let's create a new module. And with PyTest, it's good practice to have the module name start with test basic API. Let's start with some basic tests. And so this is a new module. So I need to import the requests library again, because I'm going to use it not just in my Explorer API, but also in tests. What I like about PyTest is that it's so easy and lightweight to use. Because really the only thing I need to do is write a test, literally write a test method. So the way you write a new method, or define a new method in Python, is using the def keyword, which starts the definition of a new method, which can be Pratima, that's pip install requests. Load shedding. I feel your pain. So a test method as a PyTest needs to know if a method is a test method or not. And it does so by the name of the method. So all methods that start with the word test are automatically recognized as a test method. So you'll see PyCharm including this nice green triangle here to run the test. But let's start with testing just the status code. So this is the definition of my new method. It has no arguments, not yet. And after the semicolon on a new line, start. Test method definition. Just like we did with the Explorer testing, I can start by taking some data and storing that in my response object. And instead of printing data to the console for inspection by a human being, what you typically do when you write automated tests is you include assertions, which automatically check that you agree. Can you still hear me fine? If it's anything related to the network, I don't get any indications that the network is playing up. Okay, thank you, Rajat. Thank you for confirming that. I typically get notified by Zoom if the audio quality goes down a little. So I'm just going to assume that it's working fine on my end here. So with automated tests, I did, instead of printing something to the console, I want to add an assertion. And with PyTest, you can do that using the assert keyword. And that assert keyword is followed by a comparison, an expression that evaluates to a Boolean. So for example, if I want to assert that the status code is equal to 200, I can do that by as such. Say, well, assert that the response, that the status code property of the response object is equal to, using a double equal sign, 200. And this is a fully blown automated test, which means I can also run it. Now, the way to run your tests with PyTest is not by using the Python command, but by using the PyTest command, again followed by the name of the module test. Connection error. Maybe it helps if I didn't make a typo in the endpoint. Much better. So I'll try to speak in the microphone a little bit more clearly. Hope that helps. And so this is a fully blown test, and PyTest tells me, well, I ran one test, and at this little green dot that you see here indicates that I've got a passing test, and the test run says, well, there's one test that passed, and it took just under 2 seconds. And just to show you that it's really testing something, that it's really invoking an endpoint and checking on the status code. If I change the expected value for the status code to 201, which is not equal to the actual status code, and run the test again, it's going to tell me, well, the test failed because it checked that 200 and 201 are equal, which they are not. So this is a fully blown test. Now, another assertion that I can do is, for example, on a response header. So I remember that headers are, the headers is another property of the response object. And this is a Python dictionary. And if I want to point to the value of a specific header, for example, the content type header, I can do that like this, by in straight brackets, in square brackets. Say, well, this is, I'm interested in this specific header, in this case, the content type header. And I want to check, for example, that that's equal to application/JSON, which tells me, and that's true. So now it has asserted that both that the status code is correct and that the value of the content type header is as expected. For those of you in the chat, I did not make an init file. While running pip install requests on the terminal. Pratibha, I'll get to you during the break. Let's see if we can quickly fix that. So now we know how to write an assertion for the response status code, write an assertion for a response header, yes, more specifically the content type header. Let's see if we can also, oh no, that's something we're going to do later on. Let's see what else we've got. Right, checks, HTTP 404, header. No, that's it. So we're going to look at writing checks for the response body after this one, but page 2 of the API exercises, let me quickly post that link in the chat again, for those who know, not just to you coquettes, to everybody. And for those of you who missed it, this is where the exercises are. Please refer to page 2, exercise 2. And I'm going to ask you to write a couple of tests, or one test that does everything, but then because there are different requests, and you might want to have a look at, and you might want to write different test methods to do that. And I want you to check that an HTTP GET to this endpoint returns a 200, another one that returns a 404. In the third one, I'm asking you to check the value of a content type header. And in the last one, I'm checking you to again post something, post a payload to an HTTP endpoint, just like we did in the previous exercise. But now assert that the response status code is 201. Don't do that, please. If so, just one heads up. If you want to include a print statement, you can still do so, of course. The problem is if I run my test, it does not print it. Because PyTest automatically by default swallows all your output. If you want to print it, you can do that quite easily, but you need to specify that, and you need to enable that by specifying the -s flag. Oh, there you go. And so now it prints that output again. But you need to pass the -s flag in order to actually print the result of your print statements to the output. Let's take again anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes to have a look at the second series of exercises. So again, and this is just about checking some what you might call technical data for the responses. So some response status codes for different types of operations and a response header. And just as you see in the example here. So just exercise 2, so just page 2. We'll get to the other pages as we go. That's a good question, Manish. No. A module is a Python, is Python speak for a file. So a .py file is typically a module. But a module can contain more than one test. So I can write another test here. So just pass is just Python for don't do anything. Now I've got one module with 2 tests in it. So those are 2 different things in Python. I hope that helps. One function is one test, exactly. And please keep in mind, not just you, but everybody, that your method name should start with test, because and PyCharm shows you that immediately. If I remove that, you'll see that it no longer has this nice little green triangle in front of it, which means that it's not recognized as a test anymore. And if I start with test, so the underscore, well, it's just nice, but not mandatory, but your method name needs to start with test. Yep, let me do that for you, Poonam. First thing you need to do there is import JSON, the JSON library, and then if you want to print the, for example, the JSON, pretty print the JSON response for you. You can do that by JSON.dumps, and the object you need to dump is response.json, which extracts the JSON response payload from the response object. And if you want to really print it, you can specify the amount of spaces to indent with. To print it because that's not fair. So if I default Python, when it does hash flag, you see it now prints the response body as for when the test is executed. You're welcome. What's the error, Manish? So you're probably trying to decode something that's not JSON. And that's what the error message is saying. Well, you try to decode something as JSON that is not actually JSON. That's where you get the JSON decoder. And so have another look at what it is exactly that you're trying to decode. So yes or no. The tests are just in the test basic, so you don't need the exploring an API module or class, as you call it. It's not really a class, it's a module, but I get your point. So you don't need that. No. But you do need PyTest installed. Again, using pip install PyTest. But again, that's also in the instructions. And when I say create a new module in your project, what I mean by that is create a new Python file. Yeah, because Python files are typically referred to as modules in the Python community, basically, in Python world, Python land. I'll be back in a moment. Let me quickly try and do something that might help improve the sound quality. Give me 30 seconds. Let's see if that improves sound quality or sound issues for some people. There's an air conditioning running here over my head, and that's quite noisy, so it might be that my microphone picks up on that. And I've now switched that off. Thanks, Ifiso. Yeah, the recording will absolutely be shared, Pratibha. All right. Is there anybody who would like to share their screen? It doesn't matter if you haven't finished all 4 of the tests, that's okay. But this is someone who wants to share their screen and show the rest of the group what they've done, their progress, a test they're particularly proud of. Kadim, do you want to share your screen with the group and talk us through your solution? If not, that's fine too. And this is, I know I'm sometimes putting people on the spot here and say, well, not everybody is as fond of sharing their screen and talking to groups of people they don't know. So that's totally fine. I totally understand that. But if there's anybody who would like to volunteer, then by all means do. You can't share, but you should be able to share because everybody has. Yeah, Pooja. Please do. I can hear you, Pooja.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah, hi, Ben. Yeah, hello. Hi, I'm unable to share my screen actually.
How are
Let
you?
me try once more.
I think I know what the problem is. It was because I was still sharing, which is Zoom's way of making it unable to just overtake screen sharing. But I can see your screen now.
Okay. So here I tried for all 4. So what I'm saying, first request is trying to verify the response status code.
Mm-hmm.
So here we can get passed.
Yeah,
And the
and it's
second
actually
one
two.
to
I see it's actually 2 tests in one. You included both in the same test method.
right. So is that a correct approach to do that?
Well, because you're exercising different endpoints, I would separate them into 2 different tests myself. The main reason is because if the first one fails, the second one will never get executed. And yeah, and you need to change the you need to change the name if you want to. So if the first one would fail, then the second one would never get executed. But yeah, so I would do it like I would split them up and do it like this.
Okay. So here, this is to verify the headers.
The content type header. Yep.
Yeah. And for next to verify the post status code.
Yeah. So this again, you first create a Python dictionary starting on line 15.
Yes.
With these three properties. You probably hope maybe just copied and paste that from the PDF.
Yeah, correct.
I would do too. Being lazy is a good thing sometimes. And then as you, passing that as a value to the JSON argument on line 21 will automatically convert that dictionary to an actual JSON payload. That's what request does for you.
Okay.
And as you can see, the API is happy with it. It accepts this, indicating so by that response status code of 201. So very well done.
Thank you.
Thank
you so
you.
much.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
All right, that's how it's done. Thank you, Pooja. Let's, given the time, let's take a quick 10-minute coffee break. So depending on your time zone, I was going to say let's recommence at 35 past, but then I remembered, well, there's a lot of people in India, and I think you are 3.5 or 4.5 hours ahead of us. So let's just say, let's start again in 10 minutes. That's probably easiest. Yeah, so feel free to grab some coffee, go for the bathroom break, grab some tea, smoke a cigarette, go outside for 10 minutes. We'll continue in 10 minutes time. Yeah, Manish, absolutely. Yes, please, share. I'll get to you in a moment, Rashad. I see. The end. No, this is I see the problem already. The endpoint that you're invoking is just the base URL, so it doesn't point to an actual resource. So if you say /users/1, for example, and then run it again, and yeah, don't please remove the triple quotes from lines 4 and 8. There you go. There you go. The problem is that endpoint that you invoked doesn't return JSON because it's just a base, so it doesn't point to specific data. So it doesn't return a JSON payload, and then you try to interpret the payload which isn't there as JSON, and that results in the error. So that's it. You could also have just unmuted yourself, but this is fine. This is a great way of communicating. Thank you very much. Rajat, can you share your screen, please, to have a quick look at what's wrong with?
Sure.
Can what happens when you run it from the command line? Does it run the tests then? Have you tried doing that?
No, I did not try.
Can you try it? So if you open terminal and then do pytest.
I'll have to change the directory to this.
Yeah, to API automation instead of utilities. Yeah.
Okay.
You can just go up one level with cd space ... in the terminal. Oh no, sorry. CD and then space and then ... just 2 dots. No, not the C, not the C, just a dot, you know.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, and then another dot, so 2. That goes up one directory. So yeah, that command, and then 2 dots. There you go. And now cd into API automation. Can you say run PyTest space test basic API? Tab completion works, by the way. So if you type test and then hit tab, it'll. I'll get to you in a moment, Mary.
That's it?
Yep.
It's actually saying PyTest is not recognized.
Did you install PyTest?
I actually installed like this Python packages, went to PyTest and.
Can you do it from the command line? Because that's the only way I know for sure that it's. So go to the terminal again. And then do pip install PyTest. So this installs it globally.
Okay.
Yeah, Manish, the other way would do it if you installed it into your virtual environment.
No, it's trying this error.
Doesn't work. This is strange. Unknown or so. Can you activate your virtual environment? Can you type venv tab or as venv backslash? That's a /.
Sorry.
No worries. Remove the space in between because it's a path that we're specifying here. Space capital S tab. Doesn't do tab. Scripts. There you go. / activate. Enter. Lowercase a. Enter. There you go. Now your virtual environment is active. Yeah, can you try that again?
Okay, some issue with my.
It's an application and was. Oh, it's installing things now.
Yeah.
The other thing you might want to change is, in the meantime, can you go to the file menu option in the top left of PyCharm?
Okay.
And go to settings. Open that, please, for me.
Yeah. Oh, 1 second.
No, we don't want to rename the project.
Settings. Yeah.
There we go. I think it's in build execution deployment. I don't know. Let me quickly look that up in my own installation where that setting is hiding. Settings, not appearance, not plugins. Oh. Oh, come on, where is this? So there is a way to set the preferred Test the framework. And now I totally forgot where that setting is. Oh, come on. It's no, I know it's under tools. Sorry, so not if you scroll all the way down, then please, yeah, under tools. Yeah, and expand that one, and then Python integrated tools. And then the default test set the default, yeah, for API automation, set the default test runner from unit tests to PyTest. So in the dropdown, select PyTest there. No PyTest runner found in this selected interpreter. Huh. Okay, this requires some additional configuration. What happens if you click the fix button? Because that's a.
Shall I help you?
Yes, please, Manish.
Okay, so you need to first install PyTest. Okay, so I think you need to go to the project. Just go above build or execution deployment in same settings.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you,
yeah,
Manish, since it's time again, I'd like to restart the session. So we unfortunately we need to do this at some other point in time.
Okay, sure.
Okay, but thank you for your patience, Rajat, and thank you for your help, Manish. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So now that we have looked at checking some technical data or technical properties of our responses, let's have a look at the actual response bodies. So let me start by writing a new test where we're going to check from some response body elements. So just to, let me say, stop sharing my screen again. That probably helps a lot. There we go. Let's assume we are going to check on some data in this response body. So first we need to retrieve that again. So we've briefly seen this in the previous exercises already, but before we can efficiently extract response body elements from the payload to assert on values, for example, we need to convert that payload into a format that's easy to use. And with Python and with requests, that's probably going to be a Python dictionary. So for us, there's a method that's available on the response object, which is called the Json method, and that converts my JSON response payload to a Python dictionary, and stores that into an object, which I can, for example, call body. And can then do is then, and because this is now just another regular dictionary, as you can see from the, so this returns any object, it returns the JSON encoded content of response, if any. Well, in this case there is, so it returns, and it will create a Python dictionary, and I can then access fields, for example, postcode. And for some reason, the designer of this API thought it would be a good idea to include spaces in the element names, which is not forbidden in JSON, but it's also not a really good idea because it makes the response hard to parse because you need to allow for spaces, which is always a problem in programming. But it's allowed, and the designer developer of this API thought it would be a good idea. Luckily for us now in Python, it's not that much of a problem because we are referring to our elements like this anyway. Thank you, Rajat. And then I can check out this value, and it's as we can see, it's a string. So I can simply assert that this is equal to 90210, just to make sure that it's really testing what I think it's testing. If we change the expected outcome to 90211, it tells you, well, there's an assertion error here because 90210 is not the same as 90211. So this is an easy way to parse the JSON response body, store that into an object of type, which is just a regular Python dictionary. And then you can extract a point to specific elements in that dictionary, and then assert on the values of that elements. Say, for example, if let me quickly look at the exercise to see if I'm nothing missing here. Yep. So as you can see, where is that? As you can see, the value of the places element is a list, an array, whatever you want to call it. It's a list. In JSON, that's a list. A list of places with one place in it, which means that if I want to access a value, for example, the place name element, I need to point to a specific element in this list first, which is what you, and the way to do that is at first say, well, I want to extract the value of the places element first. That's a list. And from that list, I want to retrieve the first item. And so what I've got now is this list. And if I want to retrieve the first item, that's the item with index 0. And that retrieves this item. And from that, I can, for example, extract the place name. And I'll check that that's equal to Beverly Hills. I'll show you that it's really doing what I expected to do. Beverly Hills and Beverly Hills are not the same thing. So using this, you can really drill down deep into the nested JSON structures and find the element you need and extract it from the response body, from the dictionary, and then assert on specific values, which is exactly what I'm asking you to do in exercise 3. Create a new module in your project again, or append these tests to the current one, whatever you prefer. And I'm asking you to write a test that performs an HTTP GET to this endpoint and check for the value of 3 specific elements, and then write another test for another endpoint. So this retrieves the list of all users and not just for a specific user. So where the first one And this retrieves data for a specific user, for the user with ID 1. This retrieves the list of data for all the users. And so that's the difference between, oops, this exercise. So this is just data for one user, and this exercise, which is data for all the users, and assert on some data for this one. Another 10 minutes for this. About 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes to again practice retrieving specific response body elements and asserting on their value. And please don't forget to first convert that JSON payload to a Python dictionary, because that's going to make it a whole lot easier to point to specific elements. So Ramu, you asked how to handle a browser version. The nice thing about APIs and API testing is that it doesn't really matter. So I'm using a browser here to quickly show some data that's being returned by an API, but with requests, you do requests at the HTTP level, so you don't use a browser at all. So you don't need to deal with it. It doesn't do anything with the browser. It communicates directly over HTTP. So you don't even need to think about browsers. I could say close this browser and remove all browsers from my system, and this would still work. All right, let's look at what you've got. Again, is there anybody who wants to volunteer, share their screen with the rest of the group, and show us their tests? Now, what, are you all still working on writing the tests, or do you just don't want to? That's totally fine. So, but I'd love it if somebody would like to share their screen and show what I did to the rest of the group. All right. If nobody wants to share the screen, I'm quickly going to assume that there are no further questions. Are there any questions? Somebody has a question on one of the exercises, maybe? Is there any of the exercises in particular you would like me to complete on the screen, maybe? Which of the names, Shata, for the second API? So that is this the name element, the Irvin Howell, or the company name? The name element. Okay, I'm more than happy to show that to you. Let's quickly create a new test method. So this retrieves the list of all the users. Which we then convert into a dictionary. So this is the list of all the users, and I'm interested in this one. But because the root element of this JSON response payload is a list, we need to first select the item, and in this case, the item is the user, for which we want to check the name. And so we need to point to this user, or this user, or this user, but in this case, it's the second one. And so it's the user with ID 2. Let's start with the third statement. And the second item is retrieved using the index one. And that retrieves this item from the list, after which we can then just point to its name. Go and if I run that test, you'll see it passes. Just to demonstrate that it actually does what it's supposed to do. If I change the expected name. you'll see that the actual name being retrieved is Irvin Howell, which is exactly what we expected. So the trick here is to first select the item you need from a list and using the index and then pointing to the specific name. And if you're interested in the company name, you'll do that like this, and that is, it's not Irvin Howell, it is Deco, which I think was in the PDF. That could be that could be found in the PDF. 2. All right, that's how to do it. How is API testing for an API that has a lot of properties or data? Well, the first thing I would ask is, well, do I really need all that data? Because a lot of APIs are really poorly designed, in my opinion, which means that they just return way too much data. So that's the first question I would ask. Why is the API designed like this? And isn't there a better way of designing so that it returns less data? So there are a couple of ways to deal with it. The first one is to just single out the elements that you're really interested in. But if you're interested in for a relatively large payload in all of the elements, probably an approach that looks as something like using a golden master or approval testing. That's the term I was looking for. With approval testing, you basically take an expected structure, in this case JSON, and you do a complete comparison between the expected structure and the actual structure. It's the same concept that's being used in visual testing with tools like Applitools, or Mabel does something similar, I guess. And so you take a snapshot, a screenshot, but in this case, it's not a visual snapshot. It's a snapshot of the JSON, and you compare those two JSON payloads. So that's another way of looking at it. And that concept is called approval testing. And there are lots of different libraries and tools that can help you do that. One of them that's very specific for APIs is Diffie. It says visual regression testing, but I don't know if this is still the same Diffie tool. Features, pixel, no, this is really visual. So I know there was a tool called, maybe it's been renamed since, testing services without writing tests. Let me API. Because it's something that was developed at Twitter by this person. So it's archived, it's now read only. It has probably been renamed. Oh, it's Open Diffie now. So here we go. This is it. This is what I was looking for. So this is another tool that can do something like that. Let me quickly post this link in the chat for those of you who are. I have no idea why by default it tries to. Can you link those tools to your API test suite? Oh yeah, absolutely. I haven't used this in practice, but I know it exists. So I don't have a reference project or an example project for you, but I know it exists, and I know tools like this exist to help you do this. Another concept that I would like to talk to you about and demonstrate to you. Oh, that's a lot of questions, Manish. What is contract testing? I'm just going to point you to a link to a blog post that I wrote a while ago. So this a blog post series, really. So this is the first one. Contract testing is something entirely different. So contract testing is a technique to make the process of integration testing in distributed systems a lot easier. So what we're doing here is testing the functional correctness of a specific API. And contract testing is much more about, are different components able to communicate with one another? So it's a different type of testing. So it's not one or the other. You can do contract testing on top of functional testing of individual. So the tests that we are writing right now are typically run against an individual component in a distributed system. Contract testing is about the integration of different components, and if those different components are able to talk to one another. As for your other question, are microservices and APIs the same thing? Yes and no. So an API, a microservice is typically an API, but an API doesn't have to be a microservice. That's the and so the typical characteristics of a microservice is, first of all, it's small. That's what's called a microservice, and it has one very specific task or responsibility. And with APIs in general, they might be much more and much broader in functionality and scope. But yeah, back to what another thing that I wanted to show you, and something that comes up quite often, is parameterized testing, or what some people also call data-driven testing. So especially with APIs, because a lot of APIs expose business logic, business rules, those kinds of things. And in order to properly test that, you often will want to invoke the same endpoint, call the same API, just with different values for example, path parameters or query parameters, form parameters, request body elements maybe, and send those different combinations to the same endpoint and observe their results, and to see if for all these situations, for all these combinations of input values, the API behaves as expected. Now the easy way to do this is, let's say, for example, for test for placement, for example. And so I've got a response that I get for each. Whatever. Let's have a look again at our turn, and then observe that body places first place in the list, and then the place name is equal to does this work? Hooray, it works. And so now I'm testing this. I'm writing a test for a specific combination of country code and zip code, and that has an expected outcome. But let's say maybe this API exposes some business logic, or I want to run this same test for maybe for different values, and maybe I want to do this for another place name. For example, This is where my memory might fail me, but I think this is Florence. There we go. Please don't ask me why I remember this. 4 Canada. And I think this is North Sydney, South Central. It's not, it's Whitehorse. This is B2. There we go. And so maybe I want to do this, run this same test. I will retrieve data and check on the place name for different values. So this is the cheap way to do it. Just copy and paste. Yes. Let's make sure that I execute all three of them. So this is the cheap way to do it. It's also the ugly way to do it. It's the way to do it that causes poor code quality, low maintainability, because if something changes, you need to change. It's also not immediately clear that these three tests basically test the same functionality just with different values for input and expected output. But there's a better way to do it, and that's by creating parameterized tests or data-driven tests, as they are also known. And you typically will have to rely on the capability of your unit testing framework to do this. And the good news is that every major unit testing framework supports this. Unit test supported, PyTest supports it. For Java, JUnit and TestNG support it. For C#, NUnit, XUnit, and test support it. For JavaScript, Jest supports it. Mocha supports it. And because it's so common, and the fact that you want to run the same test more than once just for different data sets. So Gerry, you'll receive, and that not just you, but it applies to everybody. The recording will be sent to you via email in a link, but we'll have to probably do some post editing and then make it available for everybody. But you will receive an email on the email address that you used to sign up for the event. So instead of doing this, the simply copying and pasting the test, I want to do this more intelligently. And the way to do that in PyTest, because we're now more talking about a feature of PyTest and not as much a feature of requests, is let's first create our data set. Yeah, so our set of test cases, test data records. And the way PyTest, the format in which PyTest expects those is a list, so enclosed square brackets of tuples. And the tuple Python is created by regular brackets with the values in between. So for example, for the first case, I have a country code, a zip code, as well as an expected place. For the second case, I have another country code, another zip code, and yet another place. And I have a third test case, which is CA, B2, B2, A, and Sydney South Central. And so this is the data that changes, that varies from one iteration, from one test case to the next. And now, instead of copying and pasting these tests, I'm simply going to remove these two and parameterize this one. And so find a way to pass this data, make it available into this test method. The way to do that is in PyTest is by using the PyTest marker. To be able to use it, I need to import PyTest into my module as well. And this parameterized marker, what you would call an annotation in Java, in Python they're called markers. It takes two arguments. The first one, or let's start with the second one, because that's the data set. And the first one is a list of the names of the fields. So the first one is the country code. The second one is the zip code. And the third one is the expected place. And I can now pass those as arguments to my method. What this string provides, so this is a single string, so please keep that in mind. It's a single string. It is still comma separated, but it's not three different, it's a single string. So this takes care of the mapping of these values to these arguments. If I would, I can turn these two, swap these two. This would mean that this would be used for the zip code, and this value would be used for the country code. So it's good practice to, it's also much more convenient and readable to keep them in the right order. But you may, in this case, we are hard coding, specifying the data in our module. But you might also specify this or read this from an external file. And maybe in that external file, all the records are still there, but just in a different order. Or all the columns or the fields are still there, but just in a different order. And you can swap things around like this. But in this case, to make our lives a little bit easier, let's just put them in the order, assign them to, pass them to our test method in the order in which they appear in our records, just to keep things simple. And what we need to do now is, instead of using these hard-coded values for the country code, the zip code, and the expected place name, is to replace these with the values of these arguments. And a convenient way to do that again in Python here is by using string interpolation or formatted string. The country code goes here, and the zip code goes here, and I can simply completely replace this with expected place. So there's no hard-coded data in there anymore. It's all being read from this data source, this data set. And if I run this test now, see that even though there's only a single test method, it runs 3 tests and all of them pass. And because, well, what PyTest does at runtime is basically flatten this structure into the 3 tests that we previously saw. Adding a 4th test case is now as easy as adding another. And now I've run 4 tests without even having to change my test method. And it's also much more clear at first glance when you look at the code that instead of having 3 separate tests that might test 3 separate things, but might also test the same thing 3 times, it's now immediately clear that I've got 1 test that tests for the place name with 3 test data records, test cases, whatever you want to call them, associated with it. So this is a much more elegant and readable way of creating tests, and especially again, because APIs are all about exchanging data, and APIs often expose business logic, and this is something that you will run in and will do especially often at the API testing level. I would like you to practice that for yourself. So exercise 4 is about creating a parameterized test. So create a new module in your project, a new Python file. Make sure to import the requests again and PyTest because you're going to need it. And create a test data structure, where, again, a list of tuples that contains the following data records. So what I'm going to ask you to do is as similar to what I just showed you on the screen, is to create a test data structure with user IDs, names, and company names. Using this marker, feed the test data structure to the test to create a parameterized test. And for all iterations or all records in the test data structure, use the value of this user ID as a path parameter, and just like I used the country code and the zip code as path parameters here. And then you probably want 2 assertions, one for the username and one for the user company name. And do that for users 1, 2, and 3. Run your test and see that it runs 3 iterations. And then just like I did for the API example, for the zip code example, sorry, is add a 4th iteration for user with ID 9 and run the test once more. And just to demonstrate that adding another test case is as simple as adding another tuple to your test data structure, and it doesn't require you to change anything in the implementation of your test method. I'll leave this one on the screen and I'll give you just over 10 minutes to do this. Amani, what can we do to secure an API so that business logic is not exposed? We as testers, well, we can notice that an API does or does not do this properly. So the APIs that we're using in this project, they are very public. They are therefore to be used by everybody. Of course, that's not true for a lot of APIs. So most APIs will be secured in some way. And there are a couple of different ways to do that, to secure them. 2 common ways are either using basic authentication, which means you'll send a username and a password with each request. What that looks like in practice is that you'll pass a request header. So let me quickly type that here, a test with authorization, because it's a really good question. So what you typically do then is request, and maybe you do a get http.my.secure. I'm not going to run it, but because I don't have an example at hand, but and you might include some request headers. The typical request header for with the authorization data is the authorization header, and there are 2. Well, one very common scheme and one very simple, but also a very secure scheme. So you can do this with again with basic authentication, which is basically a base64 encoded version of your username and your password separated by a colon. But base64 encoding is not secure at all. because every programming language can do that. There are plenty of websites where you can encode and decode to and from base64. But that's one way to do it. And so what you would typically see as the value then would be basic, and then some kind of base64 encoded string. So that's one. A much more common way to do this, to secure these APIs, is via token-based system. And one of the most commonly used schemes is Oauth, or rather Oauth, the second version of Oauth 2. And what you would typically do with APIs that are secured with Oauth 2 is first retrieve a token from somewhere. And a token is connected to a specific user, has a limited validity window, so it's only valid for a certain amount of time. And it might also restrict the data to which you have access to. And so you might have access to some data, but not to all data. And so you would typically first, using your credentials maybe, or some other form of authentication, retrieve a token from a specific endpoint, and then pass that token in the same authorization header, but then you wouldn't proceed it by basic, but by bearer. And bearer means this is a token-based authorization scheme. And then you would have some kind of string here, some kind of token. But that's not something that's base64 encoded. And this is something, the token cannot be reverse engineered into usernames or passwords or any other kinds of secrets that you want to add. That's because that's all handled by a token issuing system. And so those are the two main ways to deal with it. What we as testers can do to make it more secure is, if you see, if you have a sneaking suspicion that the API that you're testing, that you're working on, is less secure than it needs to be, is to talk to the developers and say, well, I don't think this is secure enough, and maybe even demonstrate that to them, because, well, and this is how I can access the data without being properly authorized, or without, and I don't think it should be like this, because if I can do it, our users can too. So that's my recommended way of dealing with this, is just, well, first testing if this is implemented correctly, and if it's not implemented correctly, talking to the developer, say, well, I think we've got a problem here. So kind of a long answer, but I hope it was helpful. Rajat, that's you're probably asking the wrong person here. I'm not a big fan of Excel for maintaining test data. Because of two reasons. The first one is that reading values from Excel programmatically is clunky, or at least I find it to be clunky. It can be done. It can definitely be done. I've done it myself. I've done it in Java. I've done it in C#, and I think I've done it in Python as well. So it can be done, but it's ugly. I think it's ugly and clunky. So that's reason one why I should. Actually, three reasons. Most of which are sort of kind of personal. So please don't take my answer for the absolute truth here. So that's one. I think it's clunky. Second of all, I don't really like Excel, especially not for these kinds of things, and that's because Excel allows you to do things with data formats and cell formats and all those kinds of things that for human beings a use might look very pretty, but causes all kinds of interesting issues when you try to read data from it programmatically. So that's the second one. And the third one is because it's decoupling the data from the tests, which means you have to look in two different places if you want to know what's wrong. So maybe it's the test data, maybe it's the test implementation, but that can be the case for this example as well, but at least the test data and the test implementation are in the same module. So if you really want to store this externally and not hard code it somewhere, I would do it either in a relational database, so a proper database from which you retrieve the data using SQL, for example, or a CSV file. Because a CSV file is much easier to parse, and it's just plain text. Whereas with Excel, you have workbooks with worksheets, with tables, with cells, with columns that you need to parse, and that data can be stored in all different kinds of data formats. So that makes it a lot more, well, let's call it prone to errors. Let's stick with that. Sonia, that's also a very good question. Is it common to have two asserts in a single test? And here's where you can tell I've been a consultant for too long, because it depends. So the rules and the rule books, the test book, if you see people write and talk and about test automation, they say, well, typically a test should have only one reason to fail, because that makes it easier to diagnose the test in case it fails, which means that you will only have, you should only have one assertion per test. And that's looking at it dogmatically, and so very strict, very dogmatic. However, for pragmatic reasons, for convenience and to save time, I might decide to add more than one assert to a test. For example, if the operation to retrieve the result that you want to perform the asserts on, and that may be an API call, that may be a database query, it might even be executing a batch process on some kind of system. If that's really expensive, and by expensive I mean it takes a lot of time to set up, to execute, and to parse the results, then I might choose to only do it once and then assert a couple of different things, just because it's more convenient. And so the only is it depends on the context and the situation. So if you can do it in different asserts without a big overhead or a big cost in terms of time, setup time, execution time, I'd say, well, go for different tests, because again, if a test can only fail for one reason, it's much easier to diagnose it. But there's plenty of situations where it's just not that convenient. So if you have a batch process that takes a couple of minutes and you want to assert 6 things on the result, running that batch process 6 times is probably going to be really, because it just makes your test execution time explode. So you might want to say, well, I'm just going to run it once, and then to do 6 assertions and maybe you still use 6 tests, but at least you then perform the action only once, and then do 6 assertions, maybe in 6 different tests. You can do that as well, and that basically you reuse the result in different tests. And so you still have tests with a single assert, but all of those tests reuse the same action result, basically. I hope that makes sense. All right, let's have a look at your results. Is there anybody who wants to share their solution with us? The parameterized test. Any volunteers? Yes, please, Thames. Go ahead. I think you can just take over the sharing. And, please unmute yourself and tell us what you've done.
Hi.
Hello.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to check because I'm getting an error here. If what I'm missing, because I went through, I wrote it. What am I missing?
So you're the endpoint that you're constructing. So ID, name, company, that all looks really good. However, the endpoint that you're constructing on line 13 is not right. So could you remove, because this endpoint only has a single path parameter, which is the ID. So could you replace the name parameter just with users, just with the text users on line 13? Yeah, and then also remove the squiggly brackets or the curly brackets or whatever you want to call them, and just say users there. Yep, so that's the endpoint that we're looking for. Could you remove that on-screen keyboard? Because it hides a lot of, thank you. And could you now on line 16, because you're trying to pull the street element from the body, which is kind of sad because that should be the name. Let's start with the name. Yep, and then that should be equal to the name value that you pass in. So instead of company name, yeah, that should be the name. There you go. Could you run the test now? Because this should pass. It doesn't do the assertion on the company name yet, but we'll add that as we go. Could you run the?
I'm using VS Code. Where do I run it?
It's probably easiest to do that from the command line. So could you also please, because I'm not sure if that works, remove the blank line at line 11.
Okay, sorry, I have to stop. I'm experiencing load shedding here.
Okay, sorry. No problem at all. You were well on your way, so I'll take it over from you. No problem.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And so the data, let me just quickly copy the data set. Data is, no, that doesn't need to be a capital S. Two. And that's our data set. Now Python is complaining, or PyTest is complaining about the formatting. This should now be an ID, a name, and a company name. Let's call this testable names. As you can see, well, it's really similar to what we've done. I'm now getting from a different endpoint, because it's JSON placeholder code.com. And because I'm now only using a single path parameter, this users, which is the user ID, and I now want to assert that the body, if the body name body is equal to the name, and that the company name. There we go. So it's really similar to the example. It's just the data is different, obviously, and instead of two input parameters, where we previously had two input parameters and one expected output value, we now have only one input parameter, being the user ID, and two expected output values, the name, the person name, as well as the company name, which means I have a second assert here, and I extract the body name into this, and the body and the company name, and I compare that to the company name. So if, for example, I change this value, then you'll see it tells me that it ran 3 tests. So this is the PyTest way of, so a green dot means passing test, and a big red F means failure. And it also tells me, well, it was Deco Chris and not, well, this. And there's an E missing here, which is the E that I just removed. And again, just adding another test case is as simple as specifying another tuple here. In this case, I think this it is. And adding another test case is as simple as adding a 4th tuple to our data set, and then a 4th iteration for our parameterized test. So guys, why are we splitting the company name and the name on the last assertion? I think you're referring to this. And that's because of the structure of the response pointer. So this, this is, remember, this body object is a dictionary that contains a nested structure, that represents the nested structure of our response. So this name, this notation refers to this tries to extract a top level name element from that structure, which is this one. It does not point to this one because this is a nested value, because it's inside this company element, which means we first need to extract this company element, and the result, and so the value of this company element is this bit, which in itself is another a Python dictionary in itself, and so a list of, in this case, 3 key value pairs, and from that I can then So that's why I separated here, because I need to first, from the top level of this document, extract the value of the company element, and only then can I access the actual company. I hope that helps. You're most welcome. Let's take another 10-minute break. After that, I have, depending on the time, 1 or 2 more exercises for you. And I also want to show you how to make these tests part of a continuous integration pipeline. So I'll probably only cover 1 more exercise with some, I think we won't have enough time, unfortunately, to do the last exercise. But we'll see. And because I want to talk a little bit about how to make these tests part of a continuous integration pipeline as well, because that's what I think is a very important part of what we are doing as testers, because that helps us make sure that the tests actually get executed on each build for each new version of our application code. Let's continue in 10 minutes. Enjoy your coffee break. All right. I hope everybody enjoyed their coffee, tea, whatever break. Welcome back. As I said, there's 1 more exercise that I would like you to introduce to you and give you some time to work on. I might have some time to at least demonstrate the last exercise, so you can do that at some other point in time. And as I said, I would then like to talk to you a little bit and demonstrate how to make these tests part of a continuous integration build. But let's start with another topic. So far, we've only worked with APIs that respond with data in JSON. However, there are plenty of APIs that do not work with JSON, but that only work with XML. And let me, before we start, quickly see if the API that we are going to hit is still, that looks good. Let's initialize it to make sure that actually the data that we get in return is actually the data that I expect. So this is an example of an API that returns data in XML format instead of JSON format. And where previously we had the .json method at our disposal that we could use to extract the JSON response data into a Python dictionary and then work with it conveniently. Unfortunately for XML, that's not the case. And there's no equivalent in the requests library for JSON, which means we need a different way to do this. Luckily, Python has a number of different libraries that allow you to work with XML programmatically. One of them is the Elementary library, which I'm importing right here. It's the good thing about it. This is one of the many libraries in Python that allow you to work with XML. What I like about this one is that it comes with Python itself. So it comes bundled with Python. So you don't need a third-party library to install. So let's say, for example, what if I want to write an assertion on write some assertion for this data. So let's say, for example, I want to check. So this retrieves, and this is an online banking API, unsecured, so the world's least safe online bank. But so this gives me data that's associated with the account, with account number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can see the account ID, the customer ID, the account type, and the current balance. So let's say I want to, for example, assert the associated customer ID. Let's start. Change, get, copy, and paste the endpoint because I'm just lazy. So we can't simply do response.xml or something because there is no such thing. Instead, but what I can do is parse the response content and create an element tree, an XML element tree structure from it. So what I first need to do that is that I'm going to work with the raw response content, which is the bytes, or call it a string. I'm going to create an element tree from that using the from string method. And from that, I'm going to create an element tree. So it's a bit clunky, but a little bit more complex than compared to XML, but it works. So this is now an element tree structure that I can pull, from which I can pull nodes and their values. And so, for example, I can assert that the root element, that the tag of the root element is equal to account. Takes a while to get it. Why does it take a while to get it? I don't know, but it passes. So just to show you that it really tests something. Yeah, it is account. But that's not what we were interested in. We weren't interested in the root element. We were interested in the value of this customer ID element. And the way to do that, the way to browse to or to select a specific element from this tree structure is to use the find method. To, for example, the customer ID, and I then want to have the text property because that's where the actual value is stored. And I'm going to assert that that's equal to 12212. So again, just a quick recap. We've seen this a number of times. So this is just a get and storing it's still a REST API. It's just a REST API that responds in XML with XML data rather than JSON data. To be able to effectively search, parse and search and assert on elements in that XML structure, I'm taking the response content first. I'm parsing that using the from string method, and then from the parsed content, I create an element tree. And from this element tree, I can select specific nodes. And so an XML document is a tree structure. So there's elements and nested elements and nested elements and so on. So from this, I'm checking the from this one, I'm checking the. I'm going to find an element called customer ID, and then assert on its text. This expression, so this is just that this directly points to a name, but this actually, you can, as you can see, it's a path, which means it's a string having either an element tag, which is what we used, or an XPath expression, meaning you can use a little bit more complex expressions to exactly find that element in the XML structure that you're looking for. Very similar to, for those of you familiar with Selenium, very similar to how you select and find specific elements in an HTML structure. So, for example, instead of just doing this, I can, for example, just as an example, say, let's see if this should be understood. This should be a dot, and this shouldn't be a count. It should just be. No, that doesn't work this way. No, forget it. This is something you actually need in the exercise, where with this one, say I want the number of child elements for the address element. I can do that. I think it's customers, and I want it to 112. Is this still custom? No, this is now address and find all. So this find just returns the first match to this expression. Find all returns all a list of all elements, which if I can assert on the length of that result set and say, well, I think there should be 4 child elements to this address element. There you go. It's actually but that's not the example that I was showing, because this is customer ID, and that should be again 12212. There we go. And so this is one of the, again, there are many different libraries in Python that allow you to work with XML. What I like about this one is, again, that it comes built into Python, so you don't need to deal with third-party libraries. And the trick is to create a parsable, a searchable element structure from your raw XML response content, and then use that to point to specific elements and retrieve its text value and then assert on the value. The fifth exercise, so exercise 5, practices working with XML response payloads that actually operates on this endpoint. And I want you to write a number of checks there. I'm more than fine with you. I'm more than fine with you doing it any way you like, but it's okay to have all of these assertions in one single test. Oh, by the way, let me add again the assertion for the root tag element. Tag this is so the root test count. Yes, you'll need that in the exercise as well. Yeah, so another 10 minutes or so for just to practice with an XML response payload that asserts on. So this is this example is account data. The exercise focuses on customer data. So that focuses on this response body. All right. I'll give you 1 more minute to wrap up, to finish those last few assertions. All right. Time's up. So, and I promise you, this is the last time I'm asking this. Is there anybody who'd like to share their screen and show us how they approached and solved the exercise? And don't be shy. So, Rajat, you again, maybe? So you did it before, and I know you were keen another time.
Sorry, boss, I couldn't conclude because my system is very slow.
No problem at all. No problem at all. So yeah, let me quickly go over the exercises with you. So the endpoint was this, obviously to parse the smell response. We can do the same here. I think the first check was to check that the status code is equal to 200. That the content type header was equal to application XML. The response root element is called, there we go, that the response phone number, which we can find using the find method, and it's going to use equal to this without the line break. Let's quickly see if we're still on track. Beyond. It's actually this. There we go. That's strange because I'm fairly sure that I copied this and not typed it in by hand. But anyway, so this we've seen a number of times now, the same for this. So there's no difference between JSON and XML because it doesn't concern the payload. We can use the elementary construction to first, again, take the raw response content, parse that using the elementary library, and then create an elementary from it. Assert that the root tag is equal to customer. Find the phone number in the elementary, find the phone number element. Again, that points to this element, and check that it's equal to 310 447 4121. And the final one was check that the response address element has 4 child elements. Again, I've sort of kind of shown you how to do that. But this was a test to see how your Google foo is. But that's not final. It's this one, final. That's much better. So this returns, as you can see, a list of elements. And so a list of all the elements in the element tree that match this XPath expression. I can then simply assert on its line, check that it's equal to 4. So this points to, from anywhere in the document, pick the address and then find the child element, the direct child elements of the address element. And then all we need to check is that there are 4 of them, being the street, the city, the state, and the zip code. That's it. I don't want to click on the link. So I have a bit of time left, so I'm not going to, unfortunately, we don't have the time to work on this exercise, but I do have some time to give you the introduction and the demo of what I wanted to cover in the last exercise. And that's how to work with GraphQL APIs. Now, GraphQL APIs are a little bit different from regular REST APIs in that with regular REST APIs, you typically point to a very specific resource. So you point to a customer with an ID. You point to a zip code that corresponds to a country code this and a zip code that. If you need a complex set of data, is HTML better than XML for locating? They're two completely different techniques and structures, Amani. So that's not really a comparison here. So an API will typically correspond in either JSON or XML and not in HTML. So HTML is not really relevant there, even though, yeah, I know we show the data in a browser here, but it is XML and not HTML. But GraphQL APIs are, and so if you need a complex, a rich, complex set of data with regular REST, you might need to do a lot of different API calls to get all the data that you need. Which means there's a lot of overhead and a lot of HTTP calls. With GraphQL, you can you can access all the data through a single endpoint, and you write a query to retrieve exactly those columns and those fields that you need. So it's very similar to SQL, to SQL for relational databases. It's just similar concept, but through an API. And so what you do with a GraphQL API is you write a query, which will then return data. So as an example, I've got a playground here for a weather API. Because this is an example anyway, let's use a slightly more interesting one. Let's go to the SpaceX API. So this contains data related to SpaceX, so the Elon Musk company, the privatized space travel company. And so there's a lot of data available around capsules and cores, and the history, launches, missions, rockets, and so on. Let's start simple with some data about the company. So if I want to retrieve data from the company and I want, for example, the CEO, the COO, and the name of the company. And then this is my GraphQL query. So it looks a little bit like JSON, but it isn't because it's GraphQL. However, the good news is that the response, and so this this is just a nice UI that helps you interact with the GraphQL API. The response is regular JSON, and we already know how to deal with that. So all we need to do is find a way, if we want to interact with and write tests for GraphQL APIs in Python using requests, is a way to send this query. And lucky for us, that's actually quite straightforward. So I don't need this one anymore. So let's start by defining a query. I'll use a simple multi-line string to that. This is my query now. So I copied that from this. And now to GraphQL. I always post it. So you post a query and then which returns data. The endpoint's always the same. The only thing I need to do is to pass in that query. And the way to do that is I can either do that as a payload object, which is just a JSON, again, a JSON structure with this, and say, well, I'm passing in that as is. And so I'm creating a dictionary where I send in the query with this value, which requests will then convert to JSON for me. And let's see. And that's enough, really. So the trick with GraphQL APIs is just about creating the query and passing that as the value of a query element, an element that's also called query, and that's your request body. So in the you send the query in the request body, and that's it. And let's check if this works. It does, but just the status code doesn't really tell me all that much. Let's see about the data. For example, let's check the value of the CEO field. So body, that first element is data, then company, then CEO, which should be equal to Elon Musk. That key passes, just to show you that it actually tells EM that just passes. So it really retrieves Elon Musk from that structure. So I start by extracting the value of the data element, then the value of the company element, and then the CEO. And really, it's the same as we've been doing all along, because a GraphQL API response is just in a regular JSON. The only thing that changes really is how to create the request. And you do that by passing in the actual GraphQL query in a response or in a request body payload as the query elements. Now, this is a very static query. And just like SQL queries, these queries too can be parameterized. So for example, and I can never remember this is also a valid query. This gets data for a rocket, but if we look at rocket data, I need to pass in the ID of the actual rocket. So I can hard code that into, I think that's the name and the country that I'm interested in. I could, for example, hard code an ID into this. So this gives me the name and the rocket of the name and the country where it was launched for a rocket with ID Falcon 1. But I could also say, well, no, this is actually a query into which I want to pass a parameter. Let me just copy this. It's a little bit easier. So it's a query I write myself to which I pass a variable which I'm using here. And now the only thing I need to do, and now it says, well, it's not defined. It was not. There's no value provided for this one, but I can specify that in a variable, and that can be again Falcon 1. So in this way, I can parameterize my query, and now I can change this to Falcon Heavy is another one. There we go, and I think it was Starship. Yeah, there we go. Let's stick to this one. So this, and again, I could. This is something that's really useful if I want to do my parameterized testing again. The only thing I need to say, so the query doesn't change because the query has already been parameterized. I only need to feed it different query variables. And so if this is my query, there we go. The only thing I need to do is to pass in variables. And those variables are already specified here. That is another. I pass in a set of variables, and this query only takes one variable. It could be 2, 3, many, but this only takes one. With the name ID and the value is Falcon, but Falcon 1. So if I send this payload now, I'm sending a parameterized query together with values for the variables for this query. And now I can say, for example, the name that's equal to Falcon 1, and the country is equal to the Republic Marshall Islands. Here, name. It's nested one level deeper. And of course, this one. And there's another. There we go. So again, this is something we've seen a couple of times before. First, extract the data, the value of the data element, then the value of the rocket element, then the value of the name or the country, depending on which of the fields you're interested in. The new thing, the thing we haven't seen before, is again is creating the query. But unlike our previous query, this query itself has a parameter, which makes the query reusable. And but if we want to retrieve some actual data, we also need to specify a value for that query variable, which we do through this one. So this is my passing GraphQL test. So again, there's the final exercise in this document was, well, literally asking you to do this yourself. So we've seen this, so that completes the story with regards to the exercises that I've prepared. The last thing that I want to show you before we wrap up is how to make these tests part of a continuous integration pipeline. Now, running PyTest like this produces output on the console, but it doesn't really produce output that's actually useful for, that's actually usable in a continuous integration environment, because there's no continuous integration orchestrator. I think Jenkins, GitLab, CircleCI, Bamboo, that can actually interpret this. Luckily, PyTest can produce that through the JUnit XML flag. Then again, the test API. So passing this JUnit XML flag, that produces an additional, with a file name, produces an additional report in an XML format, in the JUnit XML format. And this is a format that every continuous integration orchestrator understands and can parse and can work with. And so this is the report that your CI system will use to determine whether or not all the tests have passed and if it's safe to go to the next stage of your pipeline. This is not a feature of request producing, this is a feature of your unit testing framework, in this case of PyTest. And every mature, every popular unit testing framework can produce these kinds of reports, really. So what would that look like in practice? So the first thing we need to do then is to upload this to Git, and because that's typically what these continuous integration platforms do. They pull the code from Git, and then they run the tests. So at first we need to actually Python API. This is not a work thing yet. To effectively do this, I'm going to steal a couple of things from another directory. Where is my carrier? So I'm adding a git ignore, which tells me which files to include in version control and which ones to exclude. So it will only upload these modules. I don't want the results.xml, by the way, but so let's just quickly delete that here. There we go. Don't need that. Let's create a new repository for it. That's also called Python API Testing Workshop. Go. So I need the next thing to do is now add this code to the repository. So I'm going to add everything. Commit it. I'm going to rename the branch to main. I'm going to tell it where to actually upload the code to. Upload it. There we go. And I'll refresh this. You'll see that our test modules, my git ignore, as well as the info that because I'm using CircleCI because it's really easy to use, but I could have done something similar with Jenkins or GitLab or whatever kind of continuous integration orchestrator. The only thing I need to do now is to tell my CI system, again in this case CircleCI, how to run the tests. It's now in Git, so CircleCI, I can tell CircleCI where to pull it from. All I need to do is now, is to instruct it how to run the tests. that are in this case in this module, and then how to find and interpret the test results. I can do that with Circle CI, and this is the case for GitLab and for Jenkins to some extent as well. A lot of these pipelines are defined as pipelines as code, so pipelines in a YAML file basically. And so for Circle CI, that looks like this. So you tell it what kind of machine to run it on. You tell it to check out the code, install packages, which it doesn't even. Oh, I forgot that because I need to tell it which libraries to install, because it needs. No, don't do that. I'll do that myself. It needs requests and PyTest. I'll need to change something anyway. So I need to, because otherwise, it's always starting from a clean environment. So I need to tell it which dependencies to install. And then I need to tell it which module to run and where to store the results, just like we did on a local machine here, and where to find the test results. Again, yes, that has changed. And now, if all is well, we have a requirements txt with our dependencies, we have the info for our pipeline. So basically, we've now got everything we need to start creating that pipeline. And with Service App, because all the information is already there, it's literally just a couple of clicks. It's projects, this case, and telling it, I'd only need to point to a repository, which is this one. I can say set a project and tell it from this repository in this branch, and see if you can find this file, and that's all the info that you need. This is what I like about Circle CI. It makes it really easy to create such a pipeline, and it's already running my first build, because all of the information is in here. All the information it needs to create the environment, check out the code, install the dependencies, and run the tests is in here. And you can see it passed. So if we zoom into the workflow, you can see that it has created an environment, checked out the code, installed the dependencies, run the tests, and you can even see the output here. It was only a single test, and then uploaded the test results. So actually looking into this takes a while to process, so I can't really see anything useful here because that takes a while. But this is how easy it is to, if you have tests in code, how to add them to a CI system. I think definitely. So we're recording the session, and everybody gets it. Everybody is registered for it. So we had about 350 people who registered it. Not all of them could make it to the session live. So everybody will be sent the recording, hopefully early next week. So it takes us a couple of days to process it, probably. But you'll definitely get it in the mail. And of course, we want to make sure that our tests make our pipeline pass or fail. So let's say, for example, if I change this makes my test run pause. So if I now commit this to, let's make our test fail. The way the pipeline and service CIs are set up is that every time I push new code to GitHub, it automatically starts a new build. So if we go to projects again, to the dashboard, it's easier. And then filter on this one. It's running again. You see, well, the latest addition is let's make those tests fail. And I fully expect this to make our pipeline fail because there are now failing tests. It takes a couple of seconds because, again, it's recreating the entire environment and doing all the installations from scratch. Because in this way, you have a completely clean environment for a test run. And well, as you can see, it failed because everything. Because one test failed because the actual status code was 200 instead of 201, which is the exact same output that we see here in our local environment. And this is why you always try to run the tests before you commit them to your version control, because you want to find this out before you push your code. So yeah, that's it with regards to what I had to show you. So we've got just over 10 minutes left. I see a couple of questions in the chat already. Let's address those first because before I wrap this up. Lloyd, you asked, do you recommend any courses to learn more about API testing with Python? So yeah, we got a couple of recommendations, and this is also where I slowly start moving into telling you more about what we do at the Academy. It's a little bit slow. So as I told you at the beginning, I'm the director of the Inspired Academy, which is part of Inspired Testing. In the Academy, we offer a number of different courses, including an API testing and automation course, which we can run in a variety of different languages, including Python. So that would be my first recommendation. If you want to have some more practice with requests, I have a completely free workshop on requests. I'll post the link here. That's a deck of slides and code examples that are also in the slides, plus hands-on exercises and answers that you can. And so a lot of those exercises will repeat stuff that we've covered today. But yeah, that's one of the, that's another resource. Thank you, Venetia. Thank you for taking time out of the day to join us. Yet another resource is Test Automation University, which is a platform that you might have heard of. It's, for those of you who haven't, it's similar to Pluralsight and Udemy, but then for test automation, and it's completely free and curated. So if we filter on Python, and we have a course on API testing in Python. I've not followed this or watched this course myself, but that would be another interesting resource to check out. So yeah, that's a couple. Harshita, you ask, can we change it to time-based test execution too? Absolutely, but that's a setting of CR. So you can schedule it to run the tests at a specific, just like what you could have done with Jenkins or with GitLab or with any CI. So all CI systems support that, absolutely. Athene, you say Flask REST API testing. So Flask is an API development framework. But in the end, what you develop is an API. So the testing of it wouldn't be very different from what we have been doing today, really. Shata, you ask for the recordings. Those will be sent to you via email. So you don't have to find it, it will come to you. So Geza, you ask, are you able to run your tests in Git without committing, pushing, updating your code? You don't run your tests in Git. Git is a version control system. So I run my tests somewhere. Of course, I can run my tests on my local machine, which is what I've been doing all afternoon. But for a CI system to run my tests, well, they need to find the tests somewhere. And the typical place where they are going to find the tests, or the code that implements the tests, to be more specific, is in a version control system. And that's with CircleCF, but also with Jenkins and with GitLab. They will typically pull the code from a version control system, such as Git. So you need to make sure that those tests are available in Git first. And that's the common way of dealing with code and distributing code and making sure that everybody always has the most recent version of the code. That's what version control, that's what Git is for. So yes, you are able to run it without doing it, but it's much more efficient if you do use Git. Any other questions, either through the chat or feel free to speak up, to unmute yourself and just have a chat. I love that as well. I'm more than happy if you ask it through the chat too. I think I've covered most of the questions that are in the chat. Thank you, Puya. That's really kind of you. As a final remark, if you want to keep in touch, keep updated about everything that we do at the Inspired Academy, the best way to do that is by following our LinkedIn page. Oh, come on, it is slow. Amani, so when's the next session? If you edit, the easiest way to find out is by following the Inspired Academy, because we'll post everything there. So you'll see it in Super Admin View now, but if you say View as Member, this is the link I was searching for. So if you following the Inspired Academy company page is by far the easiest way to stay up to date with everything that we do, upcoming courses, sessions. The fact that you asked for an upcoming session and the fact that we had so many registrants, and so we had at the max, we had just under 100 attend the session live today. We had over 350 people who signed up. Now I know that most of them will probably wait for the recording to be published, and that's okay. But that makes that gives me the impression that this is useful, this is valued, this is appreciated. So we'll definitely do something like this again. And yeah, I don't know when exactly, I also don't know what the topic is going to be exactly. And but yeah, we will do more of it. And again, the best way to keep up to date is by following the Inspired Academy company page, and yeah, you'll see it popping up in your LinkedIn feed. So again, once more, the recording, a link to the recording will be in your inbox in a couple of days. Again, it takes us a bit of time to process it. I want to thank all of you too for taking the time out, of your day, for sticking with me for either the full 4 hours or part of it. I really enjoyed it. So it was for me, it was the first time I did something in this format as well. I really enjoyed it. All the questions, the interaction, so I really appreciated that. So yeah, again, thank you very much. I hope this was useful. Feel free to stay in touch if there are any questions, any other things that I can help you out with. Check out what we do at the Inspired Academy. And I hope to see you again in one of our other sessions, either an online session or a training course, or through some other way. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.